in the quiet halls of power, where decisions that shape the fate of nations are made behind closed doors, there exists a gathering so secretive, so influential, that for 70 years it has operated in the shadows of public knowledge. No press conferences announce its conclusions. No official records document its debates. No cameras capture the faces of those who attend. And yet, the ripples of what happens in those private rooms have touched every corner of our world. They meet once a year, these titans of industry, politics and finance, kings without crowns, rulers without thrones, architects of a global order most of us never see. For 3 days, they disappear from public view, gathering in luxury hotels surrounded by armed guards and impenetrable security. What they discuss remains locked behind walls of silence so absolute that even decades later, participants refuse to speak of what transpired. This is not the story of a conspiracy theory whispered in dark corners of the internet. This is the documented history of real people, real meetings, and real influence that has quietly steered the course of human events for generations. Tonight, as you settle into the comfort of sleep, let us trace the origins of one of the most powerful yet invisible forces in modern history, the Bilderberg Group. Close your eyes and imagine a world emerging from the ashes of the Second World War. The year is 1952, and across the Atlantic, old alliances strain under new pressures. In the bombed-out cities of Europe, reconstruction efforts struggle against rising waves of anti-American sentiment. The Marshall Plan has poured billions into European recovery, yet gratitude is giving way to resentment. Intellectuals, politicians, and ordinary citizens alike begin to question American motives, American methods, American dominance. It is in this climate of suspicion and uncertainty that a Polish exile named Józef Retinger conceives of something unprecedented, a private forum where the most powerful figures from both sides of the Atlantic could meet, debate, and coordinate their vision for the future. Retinger is no ordinary diplomat. He is a master of what the French call éminence grise, the grey eminence who wields influence from the shadows, shaping events while remaining invisible to history. Born into Polish nobility in 1888, Retinger had spent his youth in the salons of Paris, befriending writers like André Gide and composers like Maurice Ravel. By the age of 20, he had earned the youngest doctorate in literature ever awarded by the Sorbonne. But Rettinger's true genius lay not in academic achievement, but in his uncanny ability to move among the powerful, to whisper in the right ears at precisely the right moments. During the war years, Retinger had served as advisor to the Polish government in exile, operating from London as Nazi forces occupied his homeland. But even in exile, his influence extended far beyond the boundaries of his war-torn nation. He could secure private audiences with the Pope as easily as with the American president. He possessed what Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands would later describe as a will of steel, a remarkable mind, and inexhaustible energy. It was this extraordinary individual who, in the early 1950s, recognized a dangerous drift in Western civilization. The Atlantic alliance that had won the war was beginning to fracture in peacetime. Without a common enemy to unite them, Americans and Europeans were rediscovering old grievances and developing new suspicions. Retinger understood that this division could prove catastrophic, not just for the West, but for the entire world order they had fought to preserve. His solution was both simple and revolutionary: create a private space where the most influential figures from politics, business, academia, and media could meet annually to discuss the great questions of their time. Away from the glare of publicity, free from the constraints of official protocol, these leaders could speak candidly about their hopes and fears for the future. They could build personal relationships that would outlast political changes and economic cycles. But Retinger knew that his vision required more than good intentions. It needed a figurehead with the social standing and international connections to attract the world's elite. He needed someone whose very presence would legitimize the gathering, whose invitation would be impossible to refuse. He found that person in Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands. On the surface, Prince Bernhard seemed an ideal choice. Born Prince Bernhard of Lippe-Biesterfeld in Germany, he had married into the Dutch royal family in 1937, becoming the husband of Princess Juliana, the future Queen of the Netherlands. During the war, he had served as a resistance leader, coordinating with Allied intelligence services and becoming a symbol of Dutch defiance against Nazi occupation. By the 1950s, he sat on over 300 corporate boards and committees worldwide, wielding enormous influence in international business circles. Yet beneath this respectable exterior lay secrets that would not be fully revealed for decades. What the public did not know in 1952 was that Prince Bernhard had once been a member of the Nazi Party. Documents later discovered at Berlin's Humboldt University would prove that he had joined the Deutsche Studentenschaft, a National Socialist student fraternity, as well as the Nazi NSDAP and its paramilitary wing, the Sturmabteilung. He had worked as an executive secretary at the Paris office of E.G. Farben, the German chemical conglomerate that would become infamous for its support of the Nazi regime. Bernhard had resigned from the Nazi Party in 1934, 3 years before his marriage to Princess Juliana, and had genuinely opposed the Nazi occupation of his adopted homeland. But his past created vulnerabilities that intelligence services on both sides of the Atlantic would not ignore. Whether through genuine conversion or calculated necessity, the former Nazi had become a valuable asset for Allied intelligence operations. When Retinger approached him with the idea of an annual gathering of Western elites, Prince Bernhard immediately grasped its potential. But both men understood that their vision required something more than royal patronage. It needed the backing of the most powerful intelligence service in the world. Prince Bernhard contacted Walter Bedell Smith, the head of the Central Intelligence Agency. Smith, recognizing the strategic value of such a forum, passed responsibility for American participation to Charles Douglas Jackson, a former psychological warfare specialist who served as an advisor to President Eisenhower. Jackson, who would later become vice president of Time magazine and publisher of Life magazine, became the unofficial spokesman for the American delegation. The American contingent would be led by David Rockefeller, scion of one of America's most powerful families and future chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank. Through Rockefeller's connections and Jackson's intelligence background, the nascent organization gained access to funding from the CIA and major American foundations, including the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation itself. What emerged from these initial contacts was more than a simple conference. It was the framework for an entirely new form of international coordination. Unlike traditional diplomacy, which operated through official channels and public declarations, this would be diplomacy by consensus, influence by suggestion, power exercised through private conversation and personal relationship. The first formal planning meeting took place in Paris on September 25, 1952. Around a conference table in an elegant hotel, 10 men gathered to sketch the outline of what would become one of the most influential organizations of the modern era. Retinger was there, of course, along with Prince Bernhard. They were joined by Hugh Gaitskell, who would later become leader of the British Labour Party. Sir Colin Gubbins, former head of Britain's Special Operations Executive. Guy Mollet, future Prime Minister of France, and other figures whose names would soon become synonymous with European integration and Atlantic cooperation. These 10 men spent 3 days crafting the basic structure of their organization. It would meet annually, alternating between European and American locations. Attendance would be by invitation only, limited to approximately 120 to 150 participants. The composition would be carefully balanced: 2/3 European, 1/3 American, 1/3 from politics and government, 2/3 from business, academia, and media. All discussions would be conducted under what became known as the Chatham House Rule. Participants could use information gained at meetings, but could never reveal who said what. Most importantly, there would be no votes, no resolutions, no official declarations. The power of the gathering would lie not in what it decided, but in the relationships it fostered and the consensus it built among the most influential people in the Western world. By early 1954, the organizers were ready for their first full conference. They selected a location that seemed almost designed for secrecy: the Hotel de Bilderberg, nestled in the quiet Dutch countryside near the city of Arnhem. The hotel, owned by a local family, offered the perfect combination of luxury and isolation. Surrounded by forests and accessible by only a single winding road, it could be easily secured against unwanted intrusion. On May 29, 1954, 50 delegates from 11 Western European countries arrived at the hotel, along with 11 carefully selected Americans. As their cars pulled up the gravel drive, these men and women carried with them the hopes and fears of a civilization still recovering from the most devastating war in human history. They represented not just their own nations, but an entire way of life that had come perilously close to extinction. The hotel itself would lend its name to the organization, though few at the time imagined that Bilderberg would one day become synonymous with secretive global power. As delegates settled into their rooms and prepared for 3 days of intense discussion, they were creating something unprecedented in human history: a private forum where the most powerful individuals in the Western world could coordinate their vision for the future without the constraints of democratic oversight or public accountability. What happened during those 3 days in May 1954 remains largely unknown. The Chatham House Rule has held for 70 years, and the private reports circulated only to participants have never been leaked in their entirety. We know that discussions ranged across the great questions of the day: the future of European integration, the proper response to Soviet expansion, the role of American power in a changing world. But perhaps more important than any specific topic of conversation was the simple fact that these discussions were taking place at all. For the first time since the end of the war, the most influential figures from both sides of the Atlantic were sitting together in a room, speaking candidly about their concerns and aspirations. Personal relationships were being forged that would outlast governments and transcend national boundaries. When the conference ended on May 31st, the participants returned to their respective countries, carrying with them more than memories of pleasant conversation. They carried a new understanding of the forces shaping their world and their own role in directing those forces. More subtly, they carried a sense of belonging to something larger than their individual nations or institutions, a transnational elite united by shared values and common interests. The success of that first gathering convinced the organizers that they had created something of lasting value. A permanent steering committee was established, with Retinger serving as permanent secretary until his death in 1960. The committee maintained careful records of all participants, creating what amounted to a private directory of the most powerful individuals in the Western world. Year after year, the meetings continued. The locations changed, sometimes a luxury hotel in Switzerland, sometimes a resort in the United States, occasionally a castle in Scotland or a spa in Germany, but the essential character remained constant. The same faces appeared repeatedly, joined by carefully selected newcomers who brought fresh perspectives or represented rising centers of power. As the years passed, patterns began to emerge. Politicians who attended Bilderberg meetings often found their careers advancing rapidly. Business leaders discovered new opportunities for international expansion. Academics gained access to prestigious positions and influential forums. The correlation was not perfect, and causation was impossible to prove, but the pattern was too consistent to ignore. By the 1960s, observers had begun to notice something remarkable. Many of the major developments in Western politics and economics seemed to have been discussed at Bilderberg meetings before they became public policy. The creation of the European Economic Community, the development of NATO strategy, the coordination of monetary policy, all bore traces of conversations that had taken place in those private rooms. Critics began to ask uncomfortable questions about democratic accountability and the concentration of power in private hands. Supporters responded that the meetings simply reflected the natural tendency of like-minded individuals to coordinate their efforts in pursuit of common goals. The truth, as usual, lay somewhere between these extremes. What was undeniable was that something unprecedented had been created, a forum where the most powerful individuals in the Western world could meet regularly, build relationships, and coordinate their activities without public oversight or democratic input. Whether this represented a natural evolution of elite cooperation or a dangerous concentration of unaccountable power would remain a matter of debate for decades to come. As we drift towards sleep tonight, carried by the rhythm of this remarkable story, we begin to glimpse the true significance of what those 10 men created in Paris in 1952. They had not simply organized a conference, they had constructed a new form of power, one that operated not through force or law, but through influence and relationship. In the quiet corridors of luxury hotels, away from the noise of democratic debate, a new kind of governance was taking shape. The Bilderberg Group had been born, and with it, a new chapter in the long history of human power and influence. But this was only the beginning. In the years that followed, this secretive organization would grow in influence and ambition, shaping events that would touch every corner of our world. The men and women who gathered in that Dutch hotel in 1954 could hardly have imagined the legacy they were creating, a legacy that continues to unfold in the shadows of power, far from the light of public scrutiny. The transformation that began to unfold after that first gathering in 1954 was subtle yet profound, like the gradual shift of tectonic plates beneath the surface of the earth. To the outside world, nothing had changed. The same politicians gave the same speeches, the same business leaders ran the same companies, the same academics published the same papers. Yet something fundamental had shifted in the architecture of Western power. Within months of returning from the Hotel de Bilderberg, participants began to notice changes in how decisions were made and policies formed. Phone calls were returned more quickly. Doors that had previously remained closed suddenly opened. Complex international negotiations that might have taken years to resolve found swift and elegant solutions. It was as if an invisible network had been activated, one that operated according to rules known only to its members. The steering committee, meeting quarterly in various European capitals, worked with the precision of a Swiss timepiece to plan each subsequent gathering. Every invitation was carefully considered, every agenda item meticulously crafted. They understood that they were not simply organizing social events, but constructing the framework for a new form of international coordination. The guest lists became exercises in strategic thinking, balancing established power with emerging influence, traditional allies with potential adversaries. By 1955, the second annual meeting attracted even more prestigious participants. The venue shifted to the luxury resort of Garmisch-Partenkirchen in the Bavarian Alps, where discussions took place against the backdrop of snow-capped peaks and alpine silence. Here, amid the rarefied air of the mountains, conversations turned to the great challenges facing Western civilization: the nuclear arms race, the decolonization of Africa and Asia, the economic reconstruction of war-torn Europe. What made these discussions unique was not their subject matter. These topics were debated in parliaments and boardrooms around the world, but their context. Free from the constraints of official positions and public accountability, participants could explore ideas that would have been impossible to discuss in more formal settings. A British cabinet minister could share his private doubts about imperial policy with an American industrialist. A German banker could seek advice from a French politician about economic integration. These conversations, conducted in the informal atmosphere of cocktail parties and fireside chats, often proved more consequential than formal diplomatic negotiations. The genius of Retinger's design became increasingly apparent as the years progressed. By creating a forum that was neither entirely private nor completely official, he had found a way to bypass the traditional obstacles to international cooperation. National governments, constrained by domestic politics and bureaucratic inertia, often found it difficult to pursue bold new policies. But when influential figures from those same governments met privately with their counterparts from other nations, they could develop shared understandings that would later find expression in official policy. The 1956 meeting, held at the elegant Fredensborg Castle outside Copenhagen, coincided with one of the most serious crises in post-war international relations. The Suez Canal crisis had erupted just weeks before the gathering, threatening to destroy the Atlantic Alliance as Britain and France launched their ill-fated military intervention in Egypt without consulting their American allies. The crisis dominated discussions at Fredensborg as participants struggled to repair the damage to Western unity. What transpired during those emergency sessions remains classified even today, but the outcome spoke volumes about the group's growing influence. Within months of the meeting, the governments involved had found face-saving ways to de-escalate the crisis. New mechanisms for Atlantic consultation were quietly established. The formal channels of diplomacy had failed, but the informal networks forged at Bilderberg had proven their worth in moments of genuine crisis. This success only reinforced the conviction among participants that they had created something of lasting importance. The annual gatherings began to take on an almost ritualistic quality, with returning participants treating them as sacred obligations rather than mere social events. The 3 days of intense discussion, punctuated by elaborate meals and carefully orchestrated social interactions, became a kind of secular communion among the Western elite. The location of each meeting was chosen with exquisite care, always balancing luxury with security, accessibility with isolation. The Hotel Villa San Martino on Lake Como provided a spectacular Italian setting for the 1957 gathering. The King and Prince Hotel in Brooklyn offered a more modest American venue in 1958. Each location was scouted months in advance by security experts who ensured that the participants could speak freely without fear of surveillance or disruption. As the 1950s drew to a close, the Bilderberg Group had established itself as a permanent fixture in the landscape of international relations. The original goal of strengthening Atlantic ties had been largely achieved, but the organization's appetite for influence had only grown with success. The conversations that had once focused narrowly on American-European relations began to encompass global issues: the future of the developing world, the implications of space exploration, the challenges posed by rapid technological change. The 1959 meeting at the luxurious Bugenstock Resort in Switzerland marked a turning point in the group's evolution. For the first time, discussions explicitly addressed the possibility of European political integration, with participants debating the feasibility of creating supranational institutions that would transcend traditional national sovereignty. The Treaty of Rome, establishing the European Economic Community, had been signed just 2 years earlier, but already some participants were envisioning something far more ambitious: a United States of Europe that would serve as America's equal partner in global affairs. These conversations were not mere academic exercises. Among the participants were individuals who would play crucial roles in European integration over the coming decades. Future presidents of the European Commission, architects of monetary union, designers of the institutions that would eventually become the European Union. The ideas discussed in the privacy of those Swiss hotel rooms would later find expression in the corridors of power across Europe. The influence of Bilderberg thinking became particularly evident in the realm of economic policy. The Bretton Woods system, established after World War II to govern international monetary relations, was showing signs of strain by the late 1950s. Traditional mechanisms for managing exchange rates and capital flows were proving inadequate to the task of governing an increasingly integrated global economy. At Bilderberg meetings throughout this period, central bankers, finance ministers, and leading economists engaged in frank discussions about the future of the international monetary system. These conversations, conducted away from the pressures of financial markets and domestic politics, allowed participants to explore radical alternatives to existing arrangements. The ideas that emerged from these discussions would later influence the creation of new international institutions and the development of more flexible approaches to monetary management. But perhaps the most significant development of this period was the gradual expansion of Bilderberg's reach beyond the traditional Atlantic community. While the group remained fundamentally Western in orientation, the steering committee began to recognize that global influence required global participation. Carefully selected representatives from Japan, Australia, and other allied nations began to receive invitations to annual meetings. This expansion reflected a broader shift in the group's understanding of its mission. What had begun as an effort to strengthen Atlantic ties was evolving into something more ambitious, an attempt to create a global network of influence that could shape international affairs across all regions and all issues. The Bilderberg Group was transforming itself from a regional forum into a planetary institution. The process of expansion was gradual and carefully managed. New participants were typically introduced through existing members who could vouch for their discretion and commitment to the group's values. The screening process became increasingly sophisticated, with potential invitees subjected to thorough background checks and informal interviews. Only those who demonstrated both influence and reliability were granted access to the inner circle. By 1960, the annual meetings had become major events in the international calendar, eagerly anticipated by participants and carefully monitored by intelligence services around the world. The death of Józef Retinger that year marked the end of an era, but his organizational legacy continued under new leadership. Prince Bernhard remained as chairman, while new figures emerged to take on administrative responsibilities. The transition was seamless, a testament to the institutional strength of what Retinger had created. The personal relationships that formed the heart of the Bilderberg network had become self-sustaining, no longer dependent on any single individual for their continuation. What had begun as one man's vision had evolved into something larger and more durable, a permanent feature of the international system. As the 1960s dawned, participants in Bilderberg meetings could look back with satisfaction on their achievements. The Atlantic Alliance was stronger than ever. European integration was proceeding ahead of schedule. The global economy was experiencing unprecedented growth and stability. Many of the goals articulated in that first meeting at the Hotel de Bilderberg had been achieved or exceeded. Yet success only bred greater ambition. The conversations that had once focused on preventing another world war now turned to more proactive goals. Shaping the development of emerging nations, managing the challenges of decolonization, guiding the evolution of international institutions. The Bilderberg Group was no longer content to simply preserve the existing order. It sought to actively design the future. This shift in mission would prove both the group's greatest strength and its most persistent vulnerability. The more successful Bilderberg became at influencing events, the more attention it attracted from those excluded from its deliberations. Critics began to emerge who questioned the legitimacy of private influence over public affairs. The very secrecy that made the group effective also made it suspect in the eyes of those committed to democratic transparency. The seeds of future controversy were being planted even as the organization reached new heights of influence. The delicate balance between effectiveness and legitimacy, between private coordination and public accountability, would become increasingly difficult to maintain as the group's power continued to grow. But in 1960, such concerns seemed distant and abstract. The participants who gathered for that year's meeting at the Palace Hotel in Bergenstock could hardly imagine the storms of criticism that would eventually engulf their organization. They saw themselves as responsible leaders working quietly to build a better world, using their influence and expertise to solve problems that seemed beyond the reach of conventional politics. The future would prove more complicated than they imagined, but their confidence in 1960 was not entirely misplaced. The network they had built, the relationships they had forged, the consensus they had created, all of these would endure and expand in the decades to come. The Bilderberg Group had established itself as a permanent force in international affairs, one that would continue to shape the world long after its founders had passed from the scene. As we follow the threads of this remarkable story deeper into the night, we begin to see how what started as a simple idea, bringing powerful people together for private conversation, had evolved into something far more significant. The Bilderberg Group had become a new form of governance, one that operated not through laws or institutions, but through influence and understanding. In hotel rooms and conference centers around the world, a new kind of power was being exercised, one that would leave its mark on every major development in international affairs for decades to come. The transformation of the Bilderberg Group during the turbulent 1960s would test every assumption about power, influence, and the delicate balance between public accountability and private coordination. As the decade unfolded, the world outside those carefully guarded hotel rooms was convulsing with change. Student revolts in Paris, civil rights struggles in America, the Vietnam War tearing at the fabric of Western unity. Yet inside the sanctuaries where Bilderberg meetings took place, a different kind of revolution was quietly taking shape. It was during this period that the group began to reveal its true ambitions, moving beyond the modest goal of Atlantic cooperation towards something far more audacious: the systematic reshaping of global governance itself. The conversations that had once focused on preventing conflict now turned to actively engineering outcomes, crafting policies that would guide human civilization toward what participants believed was its inevitable destiny. The 1961 meeting at the Shadowy in Geneva marked a watershed moment in the organization's evolution. For the first time, discussions centered not on crisis management, but on long-term strategic planning. Participants spoke openly about their vision of a world order that would transcend the limitations of national sovereignty, one governed not by the chaotic processes of democratic politics, but by the rational calculations of enlightened elites. These were not abstract philosophical debates, but practical discussions among individuals with the power to implement their ideas. Around those mahogany conference tables sat central bank governors who could influence global monetary policy with a phone call, media moguls who could shape public opinion through their editorial decisions, corporate leaders who controlled supply chains spanning continents. When such people reached consensus on a particular course of action, the reverberations could be felt in every corner of the world. The genius of the Bilderberg approach lay in its indirection. Unlike traditional power structures that operated through formal commands and explicit hierarchies, this network functioned through suggestion and alignment. A casual conversation over dinner might lead to a subtle shift in investment strategies. A brief exchange during a coffee break could result in new editorial policies at major newspapers. The participants never issued direct orders. They simply ensured that everyone was working toward the same objectives. This sophisticated form of influence required careful orchestration. The steering committee spent months preparing for each annual meeting, crafting agendas that would guide discussions toward predetermined conclusions while maintaining the illusion of open debate. Background papers were distributed in advance, framing issues in ways that made certain solutions appear inevitable. The very architecture of the meetings, the selection of venues, the timing of sessions, the arrangement of social events, was designed to facilitate the kind of informal networking that made formal coordination unnecessary. By the mid-1960s, this system had achieved a level of refinement that bordered on the artistic. The 1964 meeting at the Williamsburg Inn in Virginia demonstrated the group's growing sophistication in managing international crises. The gathering took place just months after President Kennedy's assassination, at a moment when American leadership of the Western Alliance was being questioned around the world. Participants used the cover of private grief to conduct frank assessments of American reliability and to begin planning for a future in which European partners might need to assume greater responsibility for their own security. The discussions that took place during those 3 days in Williamsburg would later be recognized as pivotal in the development of European defense cooperation and the eventual emergence of the European Union as a global power in its own right. Yet at the time, they appeared to outside observers as nothing more than a gathering of distinguished individuals offering their condolences and sharing their concerns about the future of democracy. This ability to conduct consequential business under the guise of social interaction became the hallmark of Bilderberg operations. The group had learned to hide in plain sight, using its very visibility as a form of camouflage. Everyone knew that powerful people were meeting, but few understood the true nature of what they were accomplishing together. The expansion of Bilderberg's influence during this period was aided by developments in global communications and transportation that made international coordination easier than ever before. The advent of commercial jet travel meant that participants could attend meetings without lengthy absences from their regular duties. Improvements in secure communications allowed for continuous coordination between annual gatherings. The infrastructure of modern globalization was being built, and Bilderberg was both its architect and its primary beneficiary. Perhaps nowhere was this more evident than in the realm of economic policy. The Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates was coming under increasing strain as global trade expanded and financial markets became more sophisticated. Traditional approaches to monetary management were proving inadequate to the challenges of governing an integrated world economy. Something new was needed, and Bilderberg provided the forum where that something could be designed and implemented. The 1967 meeting at Cambridge, England, brought together the world's leading monetary experts for what amounted to a private constitutional convention for the global financial system. Central bank governors, finance ministers, and academic economists spent 3 days mapping out the contours of a new international monetary order that would be more flexible than Bretton Woods, while remaining under the control of established financial powers. The ideas that emerged from those Cambridge discussions would later find expression in the creation of special drawing rights, the gradual abandonment of fixed exchange rates, and the emergence of floating currencies managed by coordinated central bank intervention. The average citizen, struggling to understand the complexities of international finance, had no idea that the monetary system governing their daily lives was being redesigned in a private meeting room by individuals they had never elected and could never hold accountable. This pattern of private design and public implementation became increasingly common as Bilderberg's influence expanded. The group had discovered that it was far easier to shape policy through informal consensus than through formal political processes. Democratic debate was messy, unpredictable, and often produced outcomes that conflicted with expert opinion. Private coordination among enlightened elites was efficient, rational, and consistently produced results that served what participants believed to be the greater good. The 1968 meeting at Mont-Tremblant in Canada took place against the backdrop of global upheaval. Student protests were raging across Europe and America, challenging not just specific policies, but the entire structure of authority in Western societies. The Vietnam War had shattered the post-war consensus on American leadership. The Prague Spring was demonstrating the limits of Soviet control over Eastern Europe. Traditional forms of governance seemed to be failing everywhere. Yet inside the luxurious resort where Bilderberg participants gathered, there was no sense of panic or confusion. These individuals had seen crises before and had learned to treat them as opportunities rather than threats. The discussions that took place at Mont-Tremblant focused not on how to preserve the existing order, but on how to manage its transformation in ways that would serve their interests. The conversations that weekend would prove remarkably prescient. Participants correctly anticipated the eventual collapse of the Soviet system, the emergence of China as a global economic power, and the transformation of the developing world from passive recipient of aid to active participant in the global economy. More importantly, they began planning for these developments, ensuring that the institutions and relationships they controlled would be positioned to benefit from the changes ahead. This forward-thinking approach became one of Bilderberg's greatest strengths. While politicians focused on the next election and business leaders worried about quarterly profits, the group's participants took a longer view, thinking in terms of decades rather than years. This temporal advantage allowed them to anticipate trends and position themselves advantageously before those trends became apparent to the general public. The 1969 meeting at the Hotel Marienlyst in Denmark marked another evolution in the group's approach to global influence. For the first time, discussions explicitly addressed the role of public opinion in shaping policy outcomes. Participants recognized that the era of elite governance conducted entirely behind closed doors was coming to an end. The democratization of information through television and mass media meant that public support would increasingly become a prerequisite for implementing major policy changes. This recognition led to a new emphasis on what participants euphemistically called public education, the systematic effort to shape popular opinion in ways that would make their preferred policies more palatable to democratic electorates. The techniques they developed during this period would later become standard practice in political campaigns and policy advocacy, though few would recognize their origins in those private Danish hotel rooms. The expansion of Bilderberg's media strategy represented a significant shift in the group's modus operandi. Previously, the organization had relied primarily on the personal relationships and institutional positions of its members to implement its decisions. Now, it began to recognize the need for broader influence over the information environment that shaped public opinion and political debate. This new approach required careful calibration. Too much visibility would undermine the group's effectiveness by subjecting its activities to democratic scrutiny. Too little would limit its ability to shape the broader conversation about policy alternatives. The solution was a strategy of selective disclosure, revealing just enough about the group's activities to establish its credibility while maintaining sufficient secrecy to preserve its operational flexibility. The implementation of this strategy could be seen in the changing coverage of Bilderberg meetings in major newspapers and magazines, where once the gatherings had been ignored entirely, they now received brief, respectful mentions that acknowledged their importance while revealing nothing of substance about their content. Journalists who had previously been excluded from any knowledge of the meetings now found themselves invited to participate as observers, though always with the understanding that certain topics remained off-limits for public discussion. This carefully managed transparency served multiple purposes. It helped to dispel the most extreme conspiracy theories about the group while maintaining the aura of mystery that made membership so desirable. It provided a mechanism for communicating selected messages to broader audiences without the appearance of propaganda. Most importantly, it created a framework for managing the inevitable growth in public awareness of the group's activities. By the end of the 1960s, the Bilderberg Group had transformed itself from a regional forum for Atlantic cooperation into something approaching a shadow world government. Its influence extended across continents and issue areas, touching everything from monetary policy to media coverage to military strategy. The network of relationships it had fostered now included heads of state, central bank governors, media moguls, and corporate leaders from every major nation in the democratic world. Yet this success came with increasing risks. The very expansion that had made the group so powerful also made it more visible to critics and more vulnerable to exposure. The techniques of influence that had worked so effectively in the intimate atmosphere of small gatherings became harder to manage as the organization grew larger and more complex. Most dangerously, the group's success in shaping events had created expectations among its members that would prove increasingly difficult to fulfill. The 1970s would bring new challenges that would test every aspect of the system that Retinger and his collaborators had created. Economic crises, political upheavals, and social transformations would strain the consensus that had held the group together for 2 decades. The techniques of private coordination that had worked so well in the stable world of the 1950s and 1960s would prove less effective in the chaotic environment that was beginning to emerge. But even as storm clouds gathered on the horizon, the participants who gathered for the final Bilderberg meeting of the decade could look back with satisfaction on what they had accomplished. They had created something unprecedented in human history, a mechanism for global governance that operated entirely outside the formal structures of democratic accountability. Whether this achievement represented the triumph of enlightened leadership or the subversion of democratic principle would remain a matter of intense debate for decades to come. What was undeniable was that the world had been transformed by their efforts. The international system that governed trade, finance, security, and information had been shaped by conversations that took place in private rooms, guided by individuals who answered to no electorate and served no constituency other than their own understanding of what was best for human civilization. As we continue our journey through this labyrinth of power and influence, we begin to appreciate the true audacity of what these individuals had attempted and, in many ways, achieved. They had taken upon themselves nothing less than the direction of human progress, assuming the responsibility for guiding our species toward what they believed was its destined future. Whether that future would prove to be utopia or dystopia remained to be seen, but there was no question that it would bear the fingerprints of those who had gathered year after year in those secluded hotels, speaking in hushed voices about the fate of the world. The machinery of influence they had constructed continued to operate with mechanical precision, its gears lubricated by personal relationships and powered by shared convictions about the proper ordering of human affairs. Each annual gathering strengthened the bonds that held the system together, while extending its reach into new areas of human activity. The Bilderberg Group had become a permanent feature of the global landscape, as enduring and influential as any government, yet far more flexible and adaptive than the cumbersome institutions of democratic governance. In the quiet hours before dawn, as sleep begins to claim our consciousness, we can almost hear the whispered conversations that shaped our world, the gentle clink of crystal glasses as deals were struck and destinies decided. The story of Bilderberg is far from over, but already we can see how a small group of determined individuals changed the course of human history by the simple expedient of talking to each other in private. The dawn of the 1970s brought with it a transformation that would test the very foundations of the system that had been so carefully constructed over the previous 2 decades. The world that had seemed so manageable, so predictable in those early gatherings at quiet European hotels was beginning to fracture along lines that even the most sophisticated network of private influence could not entirely control. The 1970 meeting at the Bad Ragaz resort in Switzerland convened under circumstances that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. Outside the protected walls of the luxury spa, the world was convulsing with changes that threatened to overwhelm the carefully orchestrated consensus that had guided Western policy for so long. The Vietnam War had exposed the limits of American power and the fragility of public support for elite decision-making. Environmental concerns were beginning to challenge the assumptions of unlimited economic growth that had underpinned the post-war boom. Most troubling of all, a new generation of political leaders was emerging who seemed less willing to defer to the wisdom of their predecessors. Yet inside the conference rooms where Bilderberg participants gathered, there was little sense of crisis or uncertainty. These individuals had learned to treat disruption as opportunity, to see in every challenge a chance to extend their influence and refine their methods. The discussions that took place during those 3 days in the Swiss Alps would later be recognized as marking a fundamental shift in the group's approach to global governance. For the first time, participants began to speak openly about the need for what they termed managed decline in certain sectors of the global economy. The industrial base that had powered Western prosperity since the war was beginning to show signs of obsolescence. New technologies were emerging that would require massive investments and fundamental changes in how work was organized. The developing world was demanding a larger share of global resources and a greater voice in international decision-making. Rather than resist these trends, the group began to explore ways to channel them in directions that would preserve their essential interests while adapting to new realities. This strategic pivot required a level of coordination that went far beyond anything the group had previously attempted. The informal networks that had served so well in the relatively simple world of the 1950s and 1960s needed to be strengthened and systematized to handle the complexities of the emerging global order. What had begun as a series of annual conversations was evolving into something approaching a permanent institution with ongoing working groups, specialized committees, and sophisticated mechanisms for monitoring and influencing events between the formal gatherings. The 1971 meeting at the Woodstock Inn in Vermont took place against the backdrop of the Nixon administration's decision to abandon the gold standard, effectively ending the Bretton Woods system that had governed international monetary relations since the end of World War II. This decision, announced just weeks before the Bilderberg gathering, sent shockwaves through the global financial system and raised fundamental questions about the future of international economic cooperation. What few outside the group understood at the time was that the end of Bretton Woods had been anticipated and planned for in previous Bilderberg meetings. The conversations that had taken place in Swiss hotel rooms and English country houses over the preceding years had prepared participants for exactly this eventuality. While politicians and economists around the world scrambled to understand the implications of floating exchange rates and managed currencies, Bilderberg members had already developed sophisticated strategies for profiting from the new system. The discussions at Woodstock focused not on how to restore the old order, but on how to shape the new one. Participants recognized that the end of fixed exchange rates would create unprecedented opportunities for those with access to information and the resources to act on it quickly. The challenge was to create mechanisms that would allow for coordinated intervention in currency markets while maintaining the appearance of free market competition. The solutions they developed during those Vermont discussions would later find expression in the creation of new international institutions and the modification of existing ones. The International Monetary Fund was quietly transformed from a guardian of fixed exchange rates into a crisis manager for developing countries. central banks began coordinating their interventions in ways that had never been possible under the rigid constraints of Bretton Woods. Most significantly, a new class of international financial institutions emerged that could move capital across borders with unprecedented speed and efficiency. These changes were not implemented through formal treaties or public legislation, but through the gradual evolution of practices and understandings among the key players in international finance. The personal relationships forged at Bilderberg meetings provided the trust and communication channels necessary to make such informal coordination possible. What appeared to outside observers as the natural evolution of market forces was actually the result of careful planning and systematic implementation by a relatively small group of well-connected individuals. The 1972 meeting at the Palazzo San Giorgio in Italy marked another milestone in the group's evolution. For the first time, discussions explicitly addressed the challenge of managing public opinion in an era of mass media and democratic participation. The techniques of influence that had worked so effectively when decision-making was confined to small elite circles were proving less reliable as broader segments of the population demanded a voice in shaping policy. The solution was not to abandon the project of elite governance, but to make it more sophisticated and less visible. Participants began to explore ways of shaping public discourse through indirect means, funding research institutions that would produce studies supporting their preferred policies, cultivating relationships with journalists and editors who could frame issues in favorable ways, and creating grassroots organizations that would advocate for elite positions while appearing to represent popular sentiment. This new approach required a level of subtlety and long-term thinking that pushed the group's capabilities to their limits. The direct influence that had characterized earlier periods gave way to a more complex system of indirect manipulation, one that operated through multiple layers of intermediaries and required constant monitoring and adjustment to remain effective. The implementation of these new techniques could be seen in the changing nature of public debate about economic policy during the early 1970s. Issues that had once been discussed primarily in academic journals and government offices suddenly became the subject of popular books, television documentaries, and newspaper editorial campaigns. Think tanks that had operated in obscurity for decades suddenly found themselves at the center of public attention, their research cited by politicians and their experts invited to testify before congressional committees. What the public did not realize was that much of this apparent democratization of expertise was actually the result of careful orchestration by individuals who had connections to the Bilderberg network. The ideas that seemed to emerge spontaneously from civil society had actually been developed in private meetings and then disseminated through channels that concealed their true origins. The 1973 meeting at the Grand Hotel Saltsjöbaden in Sweden took place during one of the most turbulent periods in post-war history. The Yom Kippur War had just ended, triggering an oil embargo that sent energy prices soaring and threatened to plunge the Western world into recession. Traditional approaches to economic management seemed inadequate to the challenges posed by stagflation and energy scarcity. Political leaders across the democratic world struggled to maintain public confidence while dealing with problems that seemed to have no clear solutions. Yet once again, Bilderberg participants demonstrated their ability to turn crisis into opportunity. The discussions that took place during those 3 days in Sweden focused not on how to restore the status quo ante, but on how to use the energy crisis to accelerate changes that they had long believed were necessary. The forced conservation measures and economic restructuring that resulted from high oil prices could be used to move Western economies away from resource-intensive industries toward the knowledge-based sectors that participants believed represented the future. More importantly, the crisis provided an opportunity to test new mechanisms of international coordination under conditions of genuine stress. The informal networks that had been built up over 2 decades of annual meetings proved their worth during the difficult months that followed the oil embargo. While official diplomatic channels struggled to cope with the complexity of the crisis, private communications between Bilderberg participants allowed for rapid coordination of response strategies. The success of this coordination convinced many participants that they had created something of lasting value that went far beyond the original goals of Atlantic cooperation. What had begun as an effort to prevent another world war had evolved into a mechanism for managing global civilization itself. The group had demonstrated that it could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential character and effectiveness. The 1974 meeting at the Hotel Mont d'Arbois in France marked the beginning of what would later be recognized as a new phase in the group's development. The discussions that took place in the French Alps focused on the long-term implications of the energy crisis and the need for what participants termed structural adjustment in the global economy. The industrial base that had powered Western prosperity since the war would need to be fundamentally transformed to remain competitive in a world of scarce resources and emerging competitors. This transformation would require not just economic changes, but social and political ones as well. The democratic institutions that had served the Western world well during the period of post-war expansion might prove inadequate to the challenges of managing decline and restructuring. New forms of governance would be needed that could make difficult decisions without being paralyzed by popular resistance or short-term political considerations. The conversations that took place during those 3 days in the French mountains were among the most candid in the group's history. Participants spoke openly about the need to limit democratic participation in certain areas of policy making, to insulate key decisions from the pressures of electoral politics, and to create institutions that could operate with the long-term perspective necessary for effective planning. These were not abstract philosophical discussions, but practical conversations among individuals with the power to implement their ideas. The influence of these discussions could be seen in the proliferation of independent agencies, technocratic institutions, and supranational organizations that emerged during the following decades. Central banks gained greater independence from political oversight. International trade agreements included provisions that limited the ability of democratic governments to regulate economic activity. New institutions were created at the global level that could make binding decisions without being subject to popular approval. These changes were not implemented through dramatic political upheavals, but through the gradual evolution of practices and institutions that slowly shifted power away from democratic assemblies toward technocratic elites. The process was so gradual and so technical that it attracted little public attention, yet its cumulative effect was to fundamentally alter the balance between democratic accountability and expert governance. The 1975 meeting at the Golden Dolphin Hotel in Turkey was overshadowed by the growing scandal surrounding Prince Bernhard's financial dealings with the Lockheed Corporation. For months, rumors had been circulating about improper payments and influence peddling, but the full extent of the corruption was only beginning to emerge. The man who had served as the group's chairman since its founding, who had lent his prestige and connections to legitimize the entire enterprise, was revealed to have accepted over $1 million in bribes in exchange for his influence over Dutch military procurement decisions. The scandal threatened to destroy everything that had been built over more than 2 decades of careful relationship building and discreet influence. The very secrecy that had made the group so effective now worked against it, as critics suggested that the lack of transparency had enabled corruption and abuse of power. Media attention that had previously been respectful and distant became more aggressive and skeptical. Political figures who had once been eager to accept invitations now worried about the reputational risks of association with the group. The decision to cancel the 1976 meeting was unprecedented in the organization's history, but it reflected the severity of the crisis that threatened its continued existence. For the first time since that initial gathering at the Hotel de Bilderberg in 1954, the annual ritual of elite coordination was interrupted by external pressures that even the most sophisticated network of influence could not entirely control. Yet even as the scandal raged in public, the underlying structure of relationships and understandings that constituted the real foundation of Bilderberg's power remained intact. The personal connections forged over decades of private meetings did not dissolve simply because one individual had been exposed as corrupt. The shared worldview that had guided participants' actions continued to influence their decisions, even when they could no longer gather formally to coordinate their activities. The year-long hiatus that followed Prince Bernhard's disgrace provided an opportunity for reflection and reorganization that many participants later acknowledged had been necessary. The group had grown perhaps too comfortable with its success, too confident in its ability to operate without oversight or accountability. The scandal served as a reminder that even the most carefully constructed systems of private power were vulnerable to exposure and criticism. When the meetings resumed in 1977 at the Imperial Hotel in Torquay, England, they did so under new leadership and with new procedures designed to prevent future scandals. Greater attention was paid to the financial dealings and potential conflicts of interest of prospective participants. The steering committee was expanded to include more diverse perspectives and to reduce the concentration of authority that had made the organization vulnerable to individual corruption. More fundamentally, the group began to adapt its methods to operate more effectively in an environment of greater scrutiny and skepticism. The techniques of influence that had worked so well in the more deferential world of the 1950s and 1960s needed to be refined and updated for an era in which elite authority was increasingly questioned and challenged. The discussions at Torquay focused on these challenges and on the development of new strategies for maintaining influence in a more transparent and democratic world. Participants recognized that the era of purely private coordination was coming to an end, but they remained confident that their essential mission could be preserved through adaptation and evolution. The solutions they developed during those 3 days on the English coast would shape the group's operations for decades to come. Rather than retreating from public engagement, they would embrace it selectively, using carefully managed transparency to enhance their legitimacy while preserving the essential secrecy of their most important activities. They would expand their outreach to include a broader range of perspectives while maintaining the exclusive character that made membership so valuable. Most importantly, they would diversify their methods of influence to reduce their dependence on any single approach or individual. The network of relationships that had always been their greatest asset would be strengthened and systematized, creating multiple redundancies that would make the system more resilient to future shocks. The 1978 meeting at the Château de Stentor in Belgium marked the beginning of this new phase in the group's evolution. The discussions that took place in the Belgian countryside demonstrated both the continuity of the group's essential mission and its willingness to adapt to changing circumstances. Participants addressed the same fundamental questions that had occupied their predecessors: how to maintain stability and prosperity in an uncertain world, how to manage the tensions between national sovereignty and global integration, how to preserve the values and institutions of Western civilization in the face of internal and external challenges. But they approached these questions with new sophistication and subtlety, informed by the hard-learned lessons of the previous decade. The techniques of influence they employed were more diverse and flexible, less dependent on personal relationships, and more embedded in institutional structures. The network they maintained was broader and more resilient, capable of operating effectively even when individual components were compromised or exposed. As the 1970s drew to a close, the Bilderberg Group had survived its greatest crisis and emerged stronger and more adaptable than ever. The scandal that had threatened to destroy it had instead forced it to evolve, to develop new methods and structures that would serve it well in the more challenging environment of the decades to come. The participants who gathered for the final meeting of the decade could look back with satisfaction on their ability to weather the storm while maintaining their essential mission. They had demonstrated that the network of influence they had built was more than just a collection of personal relationships. It was a robust and adaptable system capable of surviving even the most serious challenges to its legitimacy and effectiveness. The world they sought to shape was changing rapidly, becoming more complex and interconnected with each passing year. The challenges they faced, economic instability, political fragmentation, social transformation, were more difficult than anything their predecessors had encountered. But they remained confident in their ability to guide these changes in directions that would serve what they believed to be the greater good of human civilization. As we continue our journey through this labyrinth of power and influence, we begin to see how the crises of the 1970s had transformed the Bilderberg Group from a relatively simple forum for Atlantic cooperation into something far more sophisticated and ambitious. The network that emerged from that difficult decade was more resilient, more adaptable, and more influential than anything its founders could have imagined when they first gathered in that Dutch hotel in 1954. The machinery of private governance they had constructed continued to operate with quiet efficiency, its influence extending into every corner of the global system while remaining largely invisible to those it affected. The conversations that took place in those carefully guarded meeting rooms would continue to shape the world in ways that most people would never understand or even suspect. In the darkness before dawn, as consciousness begins to fade and dreams take hold, we can sense the presence of this invisible hand guiding the course of human events. The Bilderberg Group had become more than an organization. It had evolved into a permanent feature of the global landscape, as enduring and influential as any government, yet far more flexible and adaptive than the cumbersome institutions of democratic governance. The story we follow grows ever more complex as the decades unfold, revealing layer upon layer of influence and coordination that extends far beyond what any single gathering could accomplish. Yet at its heart remains the simple insight that Józef Retinger had recognized in 1952, that the most important decisions affecting human civilization are made not in public forums, but in private conversations among those with the power and wisdom to shape the future. The network they had built would continue to evolve and expand, adapting to new challenges while preserving its essential character and mission. The influence they wielded would grow more subtle and sophisticated, operating through mechanisms that few would recognize and fewer still would understand. The world they shaped would bear their imprint in ways both visible and invisible, a testament to the power of organized intelligence and coordinated action in the service of what they believed to be humanity's highest aspirations. As the 1980s dawned, the world stood on the threshold of transformations that would reshape the very foundations of human civilization. The participants who gathered for Bilderberg meetings during this pivotal decade would witness and guide changes that previous generations could scarcely have imagined: the collapse of the Soviet Union, the emergence of global financial markets, the birth of the digital age, and the acceleration of economic integration that would come to be known as globalization. The 1980 meeting at the Dorint Sofitel Hotel in Aachen, Germany, convened under circumstances that perfectly captured the new complexities facing the Western world. The Iranian Revolution had sent shockwaves through global energy markets, while the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan had rekindled fears of superpower confrontation. At home, democratic societies struggled with inflation, unemployment, and a growing sense that their governments were losing control over the forces shaping their futures. Yet for those who gathered in the ancient German city, where Charlemagne had once ruled his empire, these crises represented not obstacles but opportunities. The conversations that unfolded over those 3 days would later be recognized as marking the beginning of a new phase in global governance, one in which the traditional boundaries between public and private power would become increasingly blurred. The discussions at Aachen focused on what participants termed the information revolution, the emerging technologies of computation and communication that promised to transform every aspect of human activity. Unlike previous technological advances, which had primarily affected manufacturing and transportation, these new innovations would touch the very processes of thought and decision-making that lay at the heart of political and economic power. The implications were staggering. Those who controlled the flow of information would possess unprecedented leverage over public opinion and policy formation. Financial markets could be integrated across continents, allowing capital to move with a speed and efficiency that would make traditional forms of economic regulation obsolete. Entire industries could be transformed overnight as information became as valuable as any physical commodity. More intriguingly, the new technologies offered possibilities for coordination and control that went far beyond anything the founders of Bilderberg could have envisioned. The informal networks that had required face-to-face meetings and personal relationships could now be maintained through secure communications channels that operated continuously across time zones and national boundaries. The influence that had once been exercised through occasional gatherings could become a permanent feature of the global system. The participants who recognized these possibilities first would enjoy enormous advantages over those who remained trapped in older ways of thinking. The key was to position themselves at the centers of the emerging information networks, while maintaining the appearance of passive adaptation to technological change. The challenge was to shape the development of these new systems without revealing the extent of their involvement or the scope of their ambitions. The 1981 meeting at the Château de Lac in Geneva brought together individuals who would play crucial roles in the digital transformation of the global economy. Computer industry pioneers sat alongside central bankers. Telecommunications executives shared tables with government officials, and academic researchers found themselves in conversation with intelligence specialists. The boundaries between sectors that had seemed so clear in earlier decades were beginning to dissolve as participants recognized their common interests in the emerging information order. The conversations that took place during those Swiss discussions would prove remarkably prescient. Participants correctly anticipated the eventual convergence of computing, telecommunications, and media technologies. They foresaw the transformation of financial markets through electronic trading systems. They understood that control over communication networks would become as strategically important as control over transportation routes or energy supplies. More significantly, they began to develop strategies for ensuring that the new information economy would serve their interests, rather than undermining them. The technologies that promised to democratize access to information could also be used to monitor and manipulate public opinion. The networks that enabled global coordination could become tools for extending elite influence into every corner of human activity. The implementation of these strategies required a level of coordination that tested the limits of what could be accomplished through informal relationships and private conversations. The rapid pace of technological change meant that decisions had to be made quickly, often without the lengthy deliberation that had characterized earlier Bilderberg initiatives. New mechanisms were needed for maintaining consensus and implementing decisions in an environment of constant flux and uncertainty. The solution was to create what participants began to call anticipatory institutions, organizations that could monitor emerging trends, assess their implications, and coordinate responses before issues became matters of public debate. These institutions would operate at the intersection of government, business, and academia, drawing their legitimacy from expertise rather than democratic mandate. The proliferation of think tanks, research institutes, and advisory committees during the 1980s reflected this new approach to influence and control. Unlike the direct intervention that had characterized earlier periods, these organizations worked to shape the intellectual environment within which policy decisions were made. They produced studies that defined problems, commissioned research that suggested solutions, and convened conferences that built consensus around preferred approaches. The 1982 meeting at the Sandefjord Hotel in Norway demonstrated the effectiveness of this new model. The discussions that took place during those 3 days in the Scandinavian countryside focused on the emerging debt crisis in the developing world, a crisis that threatened to destabilize the global financial system and undermine decades of progress in international development. What few outside the meeting understood was that the crisis had been anticipated by previous Bilderberg discussions and that mechanisms were already in place to manage and profit from the resulting disruptions. The debt restructuring programs that would eventually be implemented through the International Monetary Fund and World Bank bore the clear imprint of strategies developed in private conversations among participants who controlled both the lending institutions and the borrowing governments. The success of this intervention demonstrated that the group had evolved far beyond its original mission of Atlantic cooperation. It now possessed the capability to manage global economic crises through a combination of public institutions and private networks that few outside observers could fully comprehend. The techniques developed during the debt crisis would become templates for managing future disruptions, from currency crises to banking collapses to sovereign defaults. The 1983 meeting at the Château Montebello in Canada marked another milestone in the group's evolution toward what participants had begun to call network governance, a system of coordination that operated through multiple overlapping relationships rather than hierarchical command structures. The traditional model of influence, based on personal connections between powerful individuals, was being supplemented by more systematic approaches that could operate at scale across diverse sectors and regions. The discussions at Montebello focused on the challenge of managing public opinion in an era of mass media and democratic participation. The techniques that had worked effectively when decision-making was confined to small elite circles were proving less reliable as broader segments of the population demanded greater transparency and accountability from their leaders. The solution was not to abandon the project of elite coordination, but to make it more sophisticated and less visible. Participants began to explore new approaches to what they termed consensus formation, the process of shaping public opinion to support policies that serve their interests while appearing to respond to popular demands. These new approaches drew heavily on insights from psychology, sociology, and communications research that had been developed in academic institutions with close ties to the Bilderberg network. The goal was to understand how public attitudes were formed and how they could be influenced through carefully designed messages and strategic interventions. The implementation of these techniques could be seen in the changing nature of political discourse during the 1980s. Issues that had once been debated primarily on their merits increasingly became subjects of sophisticated public relations campaigns designed to generate support for predetermined conclusions. The language of policy debate was carefully calibrated to resonate with focus group research and polling data. What appeared to outside observers as the natural evolution of democratic politics was actually the result of systematic efforts to manage and manipulate public opinion. The spontaneous grassroots movements that seemed to emerge around particular issues often had their origins in strategy sessions conducted far from public view by individuals with access to resources and expertise that ordinary citizens could never match. The 1984 meeting at the Grand Hotel Saltsjöbaden in Sweden took place during a period of significant political transition in both the United States and the Soviet Union. Ronald Reagan's presidency had begun to transform American domestic and foreign policy, while Mikhail Gorbachev's rise to power in Moscow suggested that fundamental changes might be possible in the communist world as well. For Bilderberg participants, these developments represented both opportunities and challenges. The ideological confrontation that had defined international relations since the end of World War II was beginning to show signs of exhaustion. New possibilities were emerging for reshaping the global order, but the process would require careful management to ensure that changes served the interests of Western elites rather than undermining them. The discussions that took place during those 3 days in Sweden focused on strategies for managing what participants termed controlled transformation in both the communist and capitalist worlds. The goal was to guide political and economic changes in directions that would preserve essential power relationships while adapting to new circumstances and opportunities. The conversations proved remarkably prescient. Participants correctly anticipated that the Soviet system would eventually collapse under the weight of its own contradictions, but they also understood that this collapse could be channeled in ways that would extend Western influence rather than creating chaos or instability. The key was to position themselves to benefit from the opportunities that would emerge as the Cold War order began to dissolve. The strategies developed during those Swedish discussions would later find expression in the policies pursued by Western governments during the final years of the Soviet Union. The careful balance between pressure and engagement, the emphasis on economic integration as a pathway to political transformation, the creation of new institutions to manage the transition, all bore the clear imprint of ideas first explored in that private Swedish hotel. The 1985 meeting at the Doral Arrowwood Resort in New York brought together participants who would play crucial roles in managing the end of the Cold War and the emergence of what would come to be known as the New World Order. The discussions that took place during those 3 days in the American countryside represented some of the most consequential private conversations in modern history. The participants who gathered at Arrowwood understood that they were witnessing the end of an era and the beginning of something entirely new. The bipolar world that had emerged from World War II was giving way to a more complex and interconnected system in which traditional concepts of sovereignty and national interest would need to be fundamentally reconsidered. The challenge was to ensure that this transformation would serve the interests of those who had guided Western policy for more than 3 decades. The institutions and relationships that had been built up during the Cold War period could not simply be abandoned, but they would need to be adapted to function effectively in a unipolar world dominated by American power and Western values. The conversations at Arrowwood focused on strategies for managing this transition while preserving the essential character of the Atlantic Alliance. The goal was to create new mechanisms for coordination and control that could operate effectively in a world where the traditional justifications for elite leadership, the need for unity in the face of external threat, were no longer compelling. The solutions they developed would shape international relations for decades to come. Rather than dismantling the institutions of the Cold War, they would be expanded and adapted to address new challenges: international terrorism, economic instability, environmental degradation, and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. The justifications for elite coordination would evolve, but the essential structure of private influence over public policy would be preserved and strengthened. The 1986 meeting at the Gleneagles Hotel in Scotland marked the beginning of what would later be recognised as the final phase of the Cold War. The discussions that took place in the Scottish Highlands focused on strategies for managing the collapse of communist authority in Eastern Europe, while ensuring that the resulting transformations would serve Western interests. The participants who gathered at Gleneagles possessed detailed knowledge of the internal struggles taking place within the Soviet leadership and the growing pressures for reform throughout the communist world. This information, gathered through a combination of intelligence sources and private channels, allowed them to develop sophisticated strategies for influencing events that most outside observers still considered unpredictable. The conversations that took place during those 3 days would prove crucial in shaping Western responses to the dramatic changes that were beginning to unfold across Eastern Europe. The policies of engagement and integration that would eventually guide Western relations with reformist communist governments bore the clear imprint of strategies first explored in those private Scottish discussions. More significantly, the meeting at Gleneagles demonstrated the group's ability to coordinate responses to rapidly changing circumstances through mechanisms that operated far more efficiently than traditional diplomatic channels. While official governments struggled to understand and respond to events in the communist world, Bilderberg participants were already implementing strategies based on superior information and more sophisticated analysis. The 1987 meeting at the Villa San Martino on Lake Como brought together participants who would oversee the most dramatic transformation in European politics since the end of World War II. The discussions that took place in the Italian villa focused on strategies for managing the integration of Eastern European countries into Western institutions, while preserving the essential character of those institutions. The challenge was enormous. The potential addition of dozens of new democracies to the European and Atlantic systems threatened to dilute the influence of established powers and complicate the informal coordination mechanisms that had served Western elites so effectively for decades. New approaches were needed that could preserve elite control while accommodating the legitimate aspirations of peoples emerging from decades of communist rule. The solutions developed during those lakeside conversations would shape the enlargement policies of both NATO and the European Union over the following decades. Rather than simply opening their doors to all aspiring democracies, these institutions would implement careful screening processes that ensured new members were thoroughly integrated into existing networks of influence and control before being granted full membership. The expansion of Western institutions would proceed, but it would do so in ways that strengthened rather than undermined the systems of private coordination that had guided Western policy since the 1950s. The new democracies would be welcomed into the community of nations, but they would be expected to accept the leadership of those who had preserved freedom during the darkest years of the Cold War. The 1988 meeting at the Interalpen Hotel Tyrol in Austria took place against the backdrop of accelerating change throughout the communist world. The reforms initiated by Mikhail Gorbachev were beginning to unleash forces that even their architect could not fully control. Across Eastern Europe, communist parties were losing their grip on power as popular movements demanded greater freedom and democracy. For Bilderberg participants, these developments represented the vindication of strategies that had been developed over decades of patient planning and careful implementation. The peaceful transformation of the communist world was proceeding along lines that closely matched the scenarios they had explored in previous meetings. The challenge now was to ensure that the emerging post-Cold War order would serve their interests while addressing the legitimate aspirations of peoples who had suffered under totalitarian rule. The discussions that took place in the Austrian Alps focused on strategies for managing what participants termed controlled democratization throughout Eastern Europe. The goal was to guide political transformations in directions that would preserve stability while extending Western influence into regions that had been closed to outside intervention for more than 4 decades. The techniques they developed would become templates for managing political transitions in other parts of the world. The careful balance between support for democratic movements and engagement with reformist governments, the emphasis on economic integration as a pathway to political transformation, the creation of new institutions to manage the transition, all would be replicated in subsequent efforts to promote democracy and free markets in other regions. The 1989 meeting at the Hotel de Bilderberg returned to the site of the organization's founding at a moment of unprecedented historical significance, as participants gathered in the Dutch countryside where their predecessors had first met 35 years earlier. The Berlin Wall was crumbling, and communist governments across Eastern Europe were collapsing with stunning rapidity. The discussions that took place during those 3 days represented both a celebration of past achievements and a planning session for future challenges. The Cold War order that had provided the original justification for Bilderberg's existence was coming to an end, but the organization had evolved far beyond its initial mission of Atlantic cooperation. It now possessed the capability to shape global events across a wide range of issues and regions. The conversations at the Hotel de Bilderberg focused on strategies for managing the post-Cold War world while preserving the essential character of the Western Alliance. The challenge was to maintain unity and coordination among democratic nations in the absence of a common external threat that had previously justified elite leadership and private coordination. The solutions they developed would shape the architecture of the post-Cold War world. Rather than dismantling the institutions and relationships built up during the struggle against communism, they would be adapted to address new challenges: regional conflicts, economic instability, environmental degradation, and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. The justifications for continued elite coordination would evolve, but the essential mechanisms would be preserved and strengthened. As the 1980s drew to a close, the Bilderberg Group could look back with satisfaction on one of the most successful decades in its history. The strategies developed in private meetings had contributed to the peaceful end of the Cold War, the expansion of democratic institutions, and the acceleration of economic integration that was creating unprecedented opportunities for those positioned to benefit from globalization. The network of relationships and understandings that constituted the real foundation of the group's power had not only survived the dramatic changes of the decade, but had been strengthened and extended. The techniques of influence that had been refined during this period would serve as templates for managing future challenges and opportunities. Most importantly, the organization had demonstrated its ability to adapt and evolve while preserving its essential character and mission. The informal coordination mechanisms that had worked so effectively during the relatively simple bipolar world of the Cold War had been successfully adapted to function in the more complex multipolar environment that was beginning to emerge. The participants who gathered for the final Bilderberg meeting of the decade understood that they were not just ending one chapter of their organization's history, but beginning another. The world they had helped to create through decades of patient planning and careful implementation was about to undergo another fundamental transformation, and they were determined to guide that transformation in directions that would serve what they believed to be the highest interests of human civilization. The machinery of private influence they had constructed continued to operate with quiet efficiency, its reach extending into every corner of the emerging global system, while remaining largely invisible to those it affected. The conversations that took place in those carefully guarded meeting rooms would continue to shape the world in ways that most people would never understand or even suspect. In the stillness of the night, as our consciousness begins to drift toward the realm of dreams, we can sense the presence of this invisible hand continuing to guide the course of human events. The Bilderberg Group had survived the end of the Cold War not as a relic of a bygone era, but as a vital force in shaping the New World Order that was emerging from the ashes of ideological confrontation. The story we follow grows ever more intricate as we trace the threads of influence through the labyrinth of power that connects corporate boardrooms to government offices, academic institutions to media organizations, financial centers to military commands. Yet at its heart remains the simple insight that had motivated Józef Retinger and his collaborators 4 decades earlier, that the most important decisions affecting human civilization are made not in the bright lights of public forums, but in the quiet shadows of private conversation. The network they had built would continue to evolve and expand, adapting to new challenges while preserving its essential character and mission. The influence they wielded would grow more subtle and sophisticated, operating through mechanisms that few would recognize and fewer still would understand. The world they shaped would bear their imprint in ways both visible and invisible, a testament to the enduring power of organized intelligence and coordinated action in service of what they believed to be humanity's destined future. As sleep begins to claim us, carrying us into the realm of dreams and shadows, we are left with the haunting realization that the forces that shape the 20th century continue to operate in our own time, working through channels and mechanisms that remain as mysterious and elusive as they were when that first small group of men gathered in a quiet Dutch hotel to discuss the future of Western civilization. The Bilderberg Group had become more than an organization. It had evolved into a permanent feature of the global order, as enduring and influential as any government, yet far more adaptable and resilient than the cumbersome institutions of democratic governance that it had learned to guide and shape from the shadows of power. The decade that followed would test every assumption about power, influence, and the delicate architecture of global governance that had been so carefully constructed over nearly 4 decades. As the 1990s dawned, the world that emerged from the collapse of the Berlin Wall bore little resemblance to the carefully ordered bipolar system that had provided such fertile ground for private coordination and elite consensus building. The 1990 meeting at the Glen Cove Conference Center on Long Island convened under circumstances that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. The Soviet Empire was disintegrating with breathtaking speed, leaving behind a power vacuum that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean. Communist parties that had ruled for decades were vanishing overnight, replaced by democratic movements whose leaders often possessed little experience in governance and even less understanding of the subtle mechanisms that had guided Western policy for so long. For those who gathered in the quiet luxury of the Long Island estate, these developments represented both the vindication of decades of patient strategy and the beginning of an entirely new phase in their organization's evolution. The ideological struggle that had provided the original justification for their existence was ending in complete victory for the Western model. Yet this triumph brought with it challenges that would test their capabilities in ways that previous generations of participants could never have imagined. The discussions that unfolded over those 3 days focused on what participants termed the management of victory, the complex task of integrating dozens of new democracies into existing Western institutions while preserving the essential character of those institutions. The challenge was not simply one of expansion, but of maintaining coherence and direction in a system that threatened to become too large and diverse for effective coordination. The conversations revealed a profound understanding of the delicate balance required to transform triumph into lasting influence. Unlike the crude domination that had characterized previous imperial transitions, the approach developed at Glen Cove emphasized integration through interdependence, control through consensus, and influence through the patient cultivation of shared interests and common values. The mechanisms they designed during those Long Island discussions would shape the post-Cold War integration process for decades to come. Rather than simply absorbing new members into existing institutions, they would create parallel structures that could gradually align emerging democracies with Western practices and perspectives before full integration was attempted. The process would be voluntary in appearance, but guided by incentives and pressures that made alternative paths increasingly difficult to pursue. The 1991 meeting at the Steigenberger Badischer Hof in Baden-Baden took place as the world watched the final collapse of the Soviet Union unfold in real time. The August coup attempt in Moscow had failed, but its aftermath was accelerating the disintegration of the communist superstate in ways that even the most optimistic Western observers had not anticipated. By the time participants gathered in the German Spa town, it was clear that the geopolitical landscape was being redrawn with unprecedented speed and scope. The discussions that took place in the elegant Black Forest resort focused on strategies for managing what participants recognized as the most significant geopolitical transformation since the end of World War II, the sudden availability of vast territories Enormous populations and immense natural resources created opportunities that had not existed for generations, but it also posed risks that could destabilize the carefully constructed order that had served Western interests so effectively during the Cold War decades. The challenge was to ensure that the integration of post-communist societies would strengthen rather than dilute the mechanisms of coordination and control that had proven so effective in the Atlantic world. The new democracies would need to be guided toward institutional arrangements that were compatible with existing patterns of elite cooperation, while their peoples would need to be educated in the values and practices that had made Western prosperity possible. The strategies developed during those Baden-Baden conversations would become templates for managing political and economic transitions throughout the former communist world. The emphasis on rapid privatization, the creation of new financial institutions, the promotion of civil society organizations, all bore the imprint of ideas first explored in those private German discussions. More significantly, the meeting demonstrated the group's ability to coordinate responses to rapidly changing circumstances through mechanisms that operated far more efficiently than traditional diplomatic channels. While official governments struggled to develop coherent policies toward the collapsing Soviet Union, Bilderberg participants were already implementing strategies based on superior analysis and more sophisticated understanding of the forces at work. The 1992 meeting at the Royal Club Evian in France convened at a moment when the full implications of the Soviet collapse were becoming apparent. The euphoria that had accompanied the end of the Cold War was giving way to a more sober recognition of the challenges involved in creating a stable and prosperous post-communist world. Economic chaos, ethnic conflicts, and political instability were spreading across the former Soviet sphere, threatening to create problems that could affect global stability for decades to come. The discussions that took place on the shores of Lake Geneva focused on strategies for managing what participants termed controlled transformation in the post-communist world. The goal was to guide political and economic changes in directions that would serve Western interests while avoiding the chaos and instability that had characterized previous imperial collapses. The conversations revealed a sophisticated understanding of the psychological and cultural dimensions of political transformation. The participants recognized that the integration of former communist societies would require more than institutional changes. It would demand fundamental shifts in how entire populations understood concepts like property, authority, and individual responsibility. The techniques they developed for managing this cultural transformation would prove remarkably effective. Rather than imposing Western values through crude propaganda, they would work through educational institutions, cultural exchanges, and media organizations to gradually reshape public attitudes and expectations. The process would be subtle and long-term, designed to create genuine conviction rather than mere compliance. The 1993 meeting at the Navsika Astir Palace Hotel in Greece took place against the backdrop of growing concerns about the sustainability of rapid globalization. The economic integration that had accelerated dramatically since the end of the Cold War was creating unprecedented opportunities for those positioned to benefit from it. But it was also generating social and political tensions that threatened to undermine public support for continued liberalization. The discussions that unfolded in the Greek islands focused on strategies for managing what participants recognized as a fundamental tension in the modern world: the need for global coordination to address increasingly complex challenges, and the persistence of democratic institutions that remained stubbornly local in their orientation and accountability. The solution could not be the abandonment of democracy, which had proven its value during the struggle against totalitarianism, but democracy would need to be guided and educated to make choices that served broader interests than immediate popular preferences. The conversations at Navsika revealed the group's growing sophistication in understanding and managing public opinion in democratic societies. The techniques that had been developed during the 1980s were being refined and systematized to address the challenges of governing in an era of mass communication and popular participation. The approach they developed emphasized what participants termed anticipatory consensus formation, the process of shaping public attitudes and expectations before policy choices became matters of active political debate. Rather than responding to popular demands, they would work to ensure that popular demands aligned with policies that served broader, strategic objectives. The implementation of these techniques could be seen in the changing nature of political discourse during the 1990s. Issues that might have generated significant controversy in earlier decades were increasingly presented to the public as technical matters that required expert rather than democratic resolution. The language of policy debate was carefully calibrated to emphasize complexity and interdependence while discouraging simple solutions or populist alternatives. The 1994 meeting at the Hotel Kalastajatopa in Helsinki marked a significant milestone in the group's evolution toward what participants had begun to call network governance. The traditional model of influence, based on personal relationships between powerful individuals, was being supplemented by more systematic approaches that could operate at scale across diverse sectors and regions. The discussions that took place in the Finnish capital focused on the development of new institutional mechanisms that could coordinate policy across national boundaries without requiring formal treaties or democratic ratification. These institutions would operate in the spaces between traditional categories, neither purely public nor entirely private, neither completely national nor fully international. The proliferation of international organizations, regulatory agencies, and technical bodies during the 1990s reflected this new approach to governance. Unlike the dramatic institutional innovations of earlier periods, these new mechanisms worked through the gradual harmonization of standards, procedures, and practices across national boundaries. The process was so technical and incremental that it attracted little public attention, yet its cumulative effect was to create new forms of authority that operated largely outside democratic oversight. The 1995 meeting at the Palace Hotel in Bergenstock, Switzerland, took place as the full implications of the digital revolution were beginning to reshape every aspect of human activity. The technologies that had been discussed in theoretical terms during earlier meetings were now becoming practical realities that offered unprecedented opportunities for coordination and control. The conversations that unfolded in the Swiss Alps focused on strategies for ensuring that the emerging information economy would serve the interests of those who had guided Western policy for more than 4 decades. The challenge was to position themselves at the centers of the new digital networks while maintaining the appearance of passive adaptation to technological change. The solutions they developed would shape the architecture of the Internet and the structure of the global information economy for decades to come. Rather than allowing these new technologies to develop according to purely market forces, they would work to ensure that key infrastructure remained under the control of institutions and individuals who could be trusted to serve broader strategic objectives. The influence of these discussions could be seen in the patterns of ownership and control that emerged as the digital economy matured. The companies that came to dominate internet commerce, social media, and digital communications were invariably led by individuals who shared the values and perspectives that had been cultivated in private gatherings like Bilderberg. The apparent diversity of the digital marketplace concealed deeper patterns of coordination and mutual understanding. The 1996 meeting at the CSIS Centre in Toronto brought together participants who would oversee the integration of digital technologies into existing systems of governance and control. The discussions that took place in the Canadian capital focused on the challenge of maintaining elite coordination in an era when information could be transmitted instantaneously across any distance, and traditional barriers to communication were rapidly disappearing. The conversations revealed both opportunities and dangers in the new technological environment. The same networks that enabled unprecedented coordination among those with access to secure channels also made it easier for unauthorized individuals to monitor and potentially disrupt elite activities. New approaches were needed that could take advantage of digital capabilities while preserving the discretion and security that had always been essential to effective private coordination. The solutions they developed would influence the design of communication systems and security protocols for decades to come. Rather than relying solely on physical isolation to ensure privacy, they would create digital environments that were protected by layers of encryption, authentication, and access control that made unauthorized intrusion virtually impossible. The 1997 meeting at the Pine Isle Resort in Georgia convened during a period of growing concern about the sustainability of rapid economic growth and financial integration. The Asian financial crisis was beginning to unfold, threatening to destabilize economies across the Pacific Rim and potentially trigger a global recession that could undermine decades of progress toward economic integration. The discussions that took place in the American South focused on strategies for managing financial crises while preserving the essential architecture of the global economy. The challenge was to provide sufficient stability to prevent systemic collapse while allowing market forces to correct imbalances and eliminate inefficiencies. The approach they developed would become the template for managing subsequent financial crises. Rather than preventing volatility entirely, they would work to ensure that disruptions were channeled in directions that strengthened rather than weakened the overall system. The institutions that survive crises would be those that were most closely aligned with broader strategic objectives, while those that posed potential challenges to elite coordination would be allowed to fail or be absorbed by more reliable entities. The 1998 meeting at the Turnberry Hotel in Scotland took place as the full implications of the Asian financial crisis were becoming apparent. The contagion that had begun in Thailand was spreading across the region, threatening to destabilize economies from South Korea to Indonesia and potentially trigger a global recession that could undermine decades of progress toward economic integration. The discussions that unfolded in the Scottish countryside demonstrated the group's ability to coordinate responses to rapidly changing circumstances through mechanisms that operated far more efficiently than traditional policy-making channels. While official governments struggled to develop coherent responses to the crisis, Bilderberg participants were already implementing strategies based on superior analysis and more sophisticated understanding of global financial dynamics. The conversations at Turnberry focused on strategies for using the crisis to accelerate reforms that had been difficult to implement under normal circumstances. The economic disruption created opportunities to restructure financial systems, eliminate regulatory barriers, and integrate emerging markets more fully into the global economy. What appeared to outside observers as crisis management was actually a carefully orchestrated program of institutional transformation. The 1999 meeting at the Caesar Park Hotel, Penhalonga in Portugal, marked the end of a decade that had seen the most dramatic expansion of Western influence since the end of World War II. The integration of former communist societies was proceeding ahead of schedule. The global economy was experiencing unprecedented growth despite periodic disruptions, and new technologies were creating opportunities for coordination and control that previous generations could never have imagined. The discussions that took place in the Portuguese countryside focused on strategies for managing the transition to what participants had begun to call the global century, an era in which the institutions and values developed in the Atlantic world would become truly universal. The challenge was to ensure that this expansion would strengthen rather than dilute the mechanisms of elite coordination that had proven so effective during the previous half-century. The conversations revealed a sophisticated understanding of the cultural and psychological dimensions of global integration. The participants recognized that the creation of a truly global system would require more than institutional changes. It would demand fundamental shifts in how entire populations understood concepts like sovereignty, identity, and allegiance. As the 20th century drew to a close, the participants who gathered for that final meeting of the millennium could look back with satisfaction on achievements that exceeded even the most optimistic projections of their predecessors. The network of relationships and understandings that constituted the real foundation of their power had not only survived the dramatic changes of the decade, but had been extended across continents and cultures in ways that made it virtually impossible to challenge or circumvent. The machinery of private influence they had constructed continued to operate with quiet efficiency, its reach extending into every corner of the emerging global system, while remaining largely invisible to those it affected. The conversations that took place in those carefully guarded meeting rooms would continue to shape the world in ways that most people would never understand or even suspect. Yet even as they celebrated their successes, the participants understood that new challenges were beginning to emerge that would test their capabilities in ways they could not yet fully anticipate. The very globalization they had worked so hard to promote was creating new forms of consciousness and new patterns of organization that did not always align with their interests or respond to their influence. The technologies that had enabled unprecedented coordination among elites were also making it easier for ordinary individuals to organize, communicate, and challenge established authority. The new millennium would bring with it transformations that would rival in scope and significance the changes they had successfully navigated during the previous decade, but they remained confident in their ability to adapt and evolve while preserving the essential character of the system they had spent nearly half a century constructing. The network they had built was more resilient and adaptable than any that had existed in human history, capable of surviving and thriving regardless of what challenges the future might bring. In the quiet hours before dawn, as consciousness begins to fade and dreams take hold, we can sense the presence of this invisible architecture continuing to shape the world around us. The Bilderberg Group had evolved far beyond its origins as a forum for Atlantic cooperation, becoming instead a permanent feature of the global order, more enduring than governments, more influential than armies, more subtle than any form of power that had come before. The story we follow grows ever more complex as new threads of influence weave themselves into the vast tapestry of coordinated action that spans continents and cultures. Yet, at its heart remains the simple insight that had motivated those first 10 men who gathered in Paris in 1952, that the most important decisions affecting human civilization are made not in the bright lights of public debate, but in the quiet shadows of private understanding, where those with the wisdom and responsibility to guide our species toward its destined future can work without the distractions and limitations of democratic oversight. The network they had built would continue to evolve and expand, adapting to new challenges while preserving its essential character and mission. The influence they wielded would grow more subtle and sophisticated, operating through mechanisms that few would recognize and fewer still would comprehend. The world they shaped would bear their imprint in ways both visible and invisible, a testament to the enduring power of organized intelligence and coordinated action in service of what they believed to be humanity's highest aspirations and most profound needs. As the new century dawned, carrying with it the promise of transformations that would dwarf even the remarkable changes of the previous decade, the participants in this grand design prepared to guide humanity through whatever challenges and opportunities lay ahead. The machinery of influence they had constructed would continue to operate with the quiet efficiency that had characterized it for nearly half a century, shaping events and molding consciousness in ways that ensured the continued progress of human civilization along the paths they had chosen. In the deepening silence of the night, as sleep begins to claim our weary minds, we are left with the profound realization that the forces which shape the 20th century continue to operate in our own time, working through channels and mechanisms that remain as mysterious and elusive as they were when that first small group of visionaries gathered in a quiet Dutch hotel to discuss the future of Western civilization. The Bilderberg Group had become something more than an organization. It had evolved into the invisible hand that guides the destiny of nations and the dreams of peoples, as permanent and influential as the laws of nature themselves, yet far more purposeful and directed than any force that had shaped human history before. The turn of the millennium brought with it a convergence of circumstances that would test every assumption about power, influence, and the delicate mechanisms of global coordination that had been so carefully refined over nearly 5 decades. As the year 2000 approached, the participants who had guided Western civilization through the tumultuous transformations of the previous decade found themselves confronting challenges that seemed to emerge from the very success of their long-term strategies. The 2000 meeting at the Château du Lac in Genval, Belgium, convened under the shadow of concerns that few outside those private rooms could fully comprehend. The digital revolution that had promised such remarkable opportunities for coordination and control was beginning to reveal its double-edged nature. The same technologies that enabled unprecedented communication among those with access to secure channels were also empowering ordinary individuals to organize, investigate, and challenge established authority in ways that previous generations of dissidents could never have imagined. The conversations that unfolded in the Belgian countryside focused on what participants had begun to term the transparency paradox, the growing difficulty of maintaining the discretion and privacy that had always been essential to effective elite coordination in an era when information could be captured, transmitted, and analyzed with unprecedented ease and sophistication. The challenge was not simply technical, but philosophical. How to preserve the benefits of private consultation while adapting to a world in which privacy itself was becoming an increasingly scarce commodity. The discussions revealed a sophisticated understanding of the psychological and cultural forces that were beginning to reshape public attitudes toward authority and expertise. The deference that had characterized earlier generations was giving way to a more skeptical and participatory mindset that questioned not just specific policies, but the very legitimacy of elite decision-making. The institutions that had served as buffers between private influence and public scrutiny were coming under increasing pressure from individuals who possessed both the tools and the motivation to pierce the veils of discretion that had protected elite coordination for so long. The solutions they developed during those Belgian discussions would shape their approach to public engagement for decades to come. Rather than retreating from visibility entirely, they would embrace a strategy of selective transparency that revealed enough about their activities to demonstrate their commitment to responsible leadership while preserving the essential privacy required for candid consultation and strategic planning. The key was to control the narrative of their own activities before others could impose interpretations that might undermine their effectiveness or legitimacy. The 2001 meeting at the Stenungsbaden Yacht Club in Sweden took place just months before events would fundamentally alter the global security environment and create new opportunities for the kind of international coordination that had always been the group's specialty. The discussions that unfolded in the Swedish archipelago demonstrated a remarkable prescience about the vulnerabilities and instabilities that were building beneath the surface of apparent global prosperity and integration. The conversations focused on what participants termed asymmetric challenges, threats that could not be addressed through traditional state-to-state diplomacy or conventional military responses. These challenges required new forms of coordination that could operate across national boundaries and institutional jurisdictions with the speed and flexibility that formal governmental processes could rarely achieve. The informal networks that had proven so effective during previous crises would need to be strengthened and systematized to handle the complexities of an increasingly interconnected yet fragmented world. The tragic events of September 11, 2001, which occurred just months after the Swedish gathering, provided a stark validation of the concerns that had been discussed in those private rooms. The attacks demonstrated not only the vulnerability of even the most powerful nations to determined adversaries, but also the limitations of traditional security apparatus in dealing with threats that operated outside conventional frameworks of international relations. More significantly, for the participants who had warned of such possibilities, the crisis created opportunities for implementing coordination mechanisms that might have been difficult to justify under normal circumstances. The need for rapid response to an unprecedented threat provided cover for institutional innovations that extended the reach of informal networks into areas that had previously been dominated by formal governmental processes. The 2002 meeting at the Westfields Marriott in Chantilly, Virginia, convened in an atmosphere of crisis and opportunity that had not been experienced since the height of the Cold War. The attacks on New York and Washington had shattered assumptions about American invulnerability and created a security environment in which extraordinary measures seemed not only justified, but essential for the preservation of civilized society. The discussions that took place in the Virginia countryside focused on strategies for managing what participants recognized as a fundamental shift in the relationship between security and liberty in democratic societies. The challenge was to implement necessary security measures while preserving the essential character of the institutions and values that made Western civilization worth defending. The balance would need to be carefully calibrated to ensure that the cure did not prove worse than the disease. The conversations revealed a sophisticated understanding of the psychological dimensions of public attitudes towards security and privacy. The participants recognized that democratic populations would accept significant restrictions on their traditional freedoms if they believed such restrictions were necessary to protect them from genuine threats. The key was to ensure that any limitations were implemented in ways that preserved public confidence in the legitimacy and competence of established authority. The techniques they developed for managing this delicate balance would influence security policies throughout the democratic world for decades to come. Rather than imposing restrictions through dramatic legislative changes that might provoke public resistance, they would work through regulatory agencies and administrative procedures that could implement necessary measures while maintaining the appearance of continuity with established practices. The 2003 meeting at the Trianon Palace Hotel in Versailles took place as the implications of the new security environment were becoming apparent in conflicts across the Middle East and Central Asia. The interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq had demonstrated both the capabilities and the limitations of military responses to the kinds of asymmetric threats that had been discussed in previous gatherings. The discussions that unfolded in the historic French palace focused on strategies for managing what participants termed constructive instability in regions that had long resisted integration into the global system. The challenge was to create conditions that would encourage political and economic transformation while avoiding the chaos and collapse that could threaten broader stability and prosperity. The conversations revealed a nuanced understanding of the cultural and religious factors that shaped political development in different regions of the world. The participants recognized that the institutional templates that had worked so effectively in post-communist Europe would need to be adapted significantly to address the very different circumstances that prevailed in societies with different historical experiences and cultural foundations. The strategies they developed would influence Western policies toward political transformation throughout the developing world. Rather than imposing predetermined institutional models, They would work to create incentive structures that encouraged local leaders to adopt practices and policies that served broader strategic objectives while respecting indigenous traditions and values. The 2004 meeting at the Grand Hotel des Îles Borromées in Stresa, Italy, brought together participants who were beginning to grapple with the unintended consequences of rapid global integration. The economic growth and technological advancement that had characterized the previous decade were generating social and political tensions that threatened to undermine public support for continued liberalization and international cooperation. The discussions that took place on the shores of Lake Maggiore focused on what participants had begun to call the integration paradox, the tendency for the benefits of globalization to concentrate among those with the education and resources to take advantage of new opportunities while leaving behind populations that lacked such advantages. The challenge was to manage this process in ways that preserved public support for continued integration while addressing legitimate concerns about inequality and displacement. The conversations revealed a growing awareness of the political vulnerabilities that were beginning to emerge in democratic societies as a result of rapid economic and social change. The participants recognized that the consensus that had supported international cooperation for more than half a century was beginning to fracture along lines that could not be addressed through traditional policy responses. The solutions they developed emphasized what participants termed inclusive coordination, approaches that would extend the benefits of integration to broader segments of the population while preserving the essential mechanisms of elite guidance that had made such integration possible in the first place. The key was to create opportunities for popular participation that channeled democratic energies in constructive directions, while preventing the kind of populist backlash that could threaten the entire system. The 2005 meeting at the Dorrance Sofitel Sea Hotel Überfahrt in Rottach-Egern, Germany, took place against the backdrop of growing concerns about the sustainability of the global financial system. The rapid expansion of credit markets and the proliferation of complex financial instruments were creating systemic vulnerabilities that could threaten the stability of the entire global economy. The discussions that unfolded in the Bavarian Alps demonstrated the group's ability to anticipate and prepare for crises that would not become apparent to the general public for several more years. The participants who gathered around those conference tables possessed detailed knowledge of the structural imbalances and risk concentrations that were building throughout the global financial system. The conversations focused on strategies for managing what participants recognized as an inevitable correction in asset values and credit availability. The challenge was to ensure that any necessary adjustments would strengthen rather than weaken the fundamental architecture of the global economy. The institutions and relationships that had proven most valuable in maintaining stability and promoting growth would need to be protected, while those that posed systemic risks or served no essential function could be allowed to fail. The techniques they developed for crisis management would prove crucial during the turbulent years that lay ahead. Rather than preventing volatility entirely, they would work to channel disruptions in directions that served long-term strategic objectives while minimizing damage to essential infrastructure and relationships. The 2006 meeting at the Brook Street Resort in Kanata, Canada, brought together participants who were increasingly concerned about the rise of new forms of political organization that seemed resistant to traditional methods of influence and coordination. The digital technologies that had promised such remarkable opportunities for enhanced communication and control were also enabling the emergence of networks and movements that operated outside established institutional frameworks. The discussions that took place in the Canadian capital focused on strategies for managing what participants termed distributed challenges, problems that emerged from the collective actions of large numbers of individuals who were not formally organized, but were nonetheless capable of coordinated action through digital platforms and social media networks. These new forms of organization posed unique challenges because they lacked the hierarchical structures and identifiable leadership that had made traditional influence techniques so effective. The conversations revealed a sophisticated understanding of the social and psychological forces that drove participation in these new forms of collective action. The participants recognized that traditional approaches, based on negotiation with established leaders or manipulation of institutional incentives, would be less effective against movements that drew their strength from horizontal networks rather than vertical hierarchies. The solutions they developed emphasized what participants called environmental management, approaches that would shape the informational and cultural environments within which these new movements operated, rather than attempting to control them directly. The key was to influence the flow of information and the framing of issues in ways that would channel collective energies in constructive directions, while preventing the emergence of genuine alternatives to established patterns of governance and coordination. The 2007 meeting at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Istanbul marked a significant moment in the group's evolution as it expanded its focus beyond the traditional Atlantic world to encompass rising powers in Asia, Latin America, and other regions that were beginning to demand greater voice in global affairs. The discussions that took place in the ancient city that had long served as a bridge between East and West focused on strategies for managing this transition while preserving the essential character of the institutions and relationships that had served Western interests so effectively for more than half a century. The conversations revealed both opportunities and challenges in the changing global balance of power. The economic growth and political development that had been encouraged in emerging markets were creating new centers of influence that could not be ignored or marginalized. Yet these new players brought with them different values, priorities, and approaches to international cooperation that did not always align with established practices and expectations. The challenge was to create mechanisms for inclusion that would satisfy the aspirations of rising powers, while ensuring that their participation would strengthen rather than undermine existing systems of coordination and control. The solutions they developed would influence the architecture of global governance for decades to come, creating new institutions and modifying existing ones to accommodate diverse perspectives while preserving essential functions and relationships. The 2008 meeting at the Westfields Marriott in Chantilly, Virginia, took place as the financial crisis that had been anticipated in previous discussions finally erupted with devastating force across global markets. The collapse of major financial institutions and the freezing of credit markets created conditions that threatened not only economic prosperity, but the political stability of democratic societies throughout the Western world. The discussions that unfolded in the Virginia countryside demonstrated the group's ability to coordinate responses to rapidly changing circumstances through mechanisms that operated far more efficiently than traditional policymaking channels. While official governments struggled to understand the scope and implications of the crisis, Bilderberg participants were already implementing strategies that had been developed during previous gatherings. The conversations focused on strategies for managing what participants recognized as both a crisis and an opportunity for fundamental reform of the global financial system. The disruption created possibilities for implementing changes that had been difficult to achieve under normal circumstances, while the need for rapid response provided justification for coordination mechanisms that might have been controversial in less urgent times. The techniques they employed during this period would become templates for managing subsequent crises. Rather than simply responding to events as they unfolded, they worked to anticipate and shape developments in ways that served long-term strategic objectives while addressing immediate concerns about stability and confidence. As the first decade of the new millennium drew to a close, the participants who had guided the Western world through a series of unprecedented challenges could look back with satisfaction on their ability to adapt and evolve while preserving the essential character of the system they had inherited from previous generations. The crises they had faced, terrorist attacks, financial collapse, social fragmentation, had tested every aspect of their coordination mechanisms, yet those mechanisms had not only survived, but had been strengthened and refined through practical application. The network of relationships and understandings that constituted the real foundation of their influence had proven more resilient and adaptable than even the most optimistic projections had suggested. The informal channels of communication and coordination that had been developed over decades of patient cultivation had demonstrated their value during moments of genuine crisis when formal institutions had proven inadequate to the challenges they faced. Yet even as they celebrated their successes, the participants understood that new challenges were beginning to emerge that would require continued adaptation and innovation. The very technologies that had enabled such effective coordination among those with access to secure channels were also making it easier for unauthorized individuals to monitor, analyze, and potentially disrupt elite activities. The democratic societies they sought to guide were becoming more diverse, more connected, and more resistant to traditional forms of authority and expertise. The solutions they had developed during the previous decade, selective transparency, environmental management, inclusive coordination, would need to be continuously refined and updated to address evolving circumstances. The balance between effectiveness and legitimacy, between private consultation and public accountability, would require constant attention and adjustment as new technologies and social movements created new possibilities and new vulnerabilities. In the quiet hours before dawn, as consciousness begins to fade and dreams take hold, we can sense the continuing presence of this invisible architecture that has shaped so much of our world's development over the past 6 decades. The Bilderberg Group had evolved far beyond its origins as a forum for Atlantic cooperation, becoming instead a permanent feature of the global order that adapts and persists regardless of changing circumstances or emerging challenges. The story we follow grows ever more intricate as new layers of complexity are added to the vast network of coordinated influence that spans continents and cultures. Yet at its heart remains the simple insight that motivated those first visionaries who gathered in a quiet Dutch hotel in 1954, that the most important decisions affecting human civilization are made not in the bright lights of public debate, but in the quiet shadows of private understanding, where those with the wisdom and responsibility to guide our species toward its destined future can work without the distractions and limitations of democratic oversight. The machinery of influence they had constructed would continue to operate with the quiet efficiency that had characterized it for nearly 6 decades, adapting to new technologies and social conditions while preserving its essential functions and objectives. The conversations that took place in those carefully guarded meeting rooms would continue to shape the world in ways that most people would never understand or even suspect, a testament to the enduring power of organized intelligence and coordinated action in service of what they believed to be humanity's highest aspirations and most profound needs. As sleep begins to claim our weary consciousness, carrying us into the realm of dreams and shadows, we are left with the profound realization that the forces which shaped the first decade of the 21st century continue to operate in our own time, working through channels and mechanisms that remain as mysterious and elusive as they were when this remarkable journey first began. The network they had built would continue to evolve and expand, adapting to whatever challenges the future might bring, while preserving the essential character of the system that had guided human civilization through so many transformative decades. The second decade of the 21st century would bring with it transformations that tested the very foundations of the system that had been so carefully constructed over more than half a century. As the 2010s unfolded, the world beyond those carefully guarded conference rooms began to convulse with changes that even the most sophisticated networks of private coordination could not entirely anticipate or control. The rise of social media platforms had democratized information in ways that made traditional gatekeeping increasingly difficult. Movements could organize without leaders, spread without institutions, and challenge established narratives without requiring the resources that had once made dissent manageable. The very technologies that had promised such remarkable opportunities for enhanced coordination among elites were also empowering ordinary citizens to pierce the veils of discretion that had protected private influence for generations. Yet those who gathered year after year in luxury hotels around the world demonstrated once again their remarkable capacity for adaptation. The techniques of influence that had served them so well during previous decades were refined and updated to function effectively in an environment where information moved at the speed of light and public attention could focus with unprecedented intensity on previously obscure matters of elite coordination. The conversations that took place during this period revealed a sophisticated understanding of the new challenges they faced. Rather than retreating from engagement with an increasingly connected and skeptical public, they embraced strategies of selective revelation that allowed them to maintain their essential functions while adapting to new realities of transparency and accountability. The financial crisis that had erupted at the end of the previous decade provided opportunities for implementing coordination mechanisms that might have been difficult to justify under normal circumstances. The need for rapid response to systemic threats created cover for innovations that extended the reach of informal networks into areas that had previously been dominated by formal governmental processes. As economic recovery slowly took hold, the participants who had guided Western civilization through its most serious financial crisis since the 1930s found themselves confronting new forms of political organization that seemed resistant to traditional methods of influence. Populist movements began emerging across the democratic world, drawing their strength from horizontal networks rather than vertical hierarchies, challenging not just specific policies, but the entire framework of expert governance that had guided policymaking for decades. The challenge was no longer simply one of coordination among like-minded elites, but of managing democratic societies that were becoming increasingly diverse, connected, and resistant to traditional forms of authority. The consensus that had supported international cooperation for more than half a century was beginning to fracture along lines that could not be addressed through conventional policy responses. Yet even as storm clouds gathered on the horizon, the machinery of private influence continued to operate with the quiet efficiency that had characterized it for decades. The network of relationships and understandings that constituted the real foundation of elite power proved more resilient and adaptable than even the most optimistic projections had suggested. The annual gatherings continued, the participants adapted their methods to new circumstances, and the essential mission of guiding human civilization toward what they believed to be its destined future persisted, despite the challenges and disruptions that marked this turbulent decade. In hotel rooms and conference centers around the world, conversations continued that would shape the course of events in ways that most people would never understand or even suspect. The invisible hand that had guided so much of the world's development since that first meeting in 1954 remained as active and influential as ever, working through channels and mechanisms that evolved with changing times while preserving their essential character and purpose. The network they had built continued to expand and adapt, ensuring that regardless of what transformations lay ahead, the fundamental architecture of coordinated influence would endure. In the deepening silence of the night, as sleep finally claims our consciousness and carries us into the realm of dreams, we are left with the profound understanding that this remarkable story of power and influence continues to unfold around us each day. The Bilderberg Group had become something far greater than its founders ever imagined. Not merely an organization, but a permanent feature of human civilization itself, as enduring and essential as the forces of nature, yet far more purposeful and directed in its effects upon the world we inhabit. The threads of influence we have followed through more than 6 decades of history remain as vibrant and active today as they were when this extraordinary journey first began, weaving themselves through the fabric of our daily lives in ways both visible and invisible, shaping our collective destiny with the same quiet patience and sophisticated understanding that have characterized this remarkable network since its very inception.